In understanding Rorty's intentions in terms of the topic of the invention of the mind in his book Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, it's clear that he wants to understand why and how we inherited that conceptual framework, which involves distinguishing between the mind, mental events, and the body, or bodily events. We've inherited a conceptual framework based on Descartes' philosophy, which involved the mind-body dualism. The mind was regarded, or mental events were regarded as immaterial. They had a temporal characteristic, but they can't be located in space, while events in our bodies are both temporal and spatially based. So in the history of philosophy, Descartes supported the distinction by describing these mental events or working of the minds as conscious and bodily processes as unconscious. In this way, he differed from the Greeks, such as Plato's understanding of the mind as reason, and the body understood in terms of passions and instincts. But Descartes went further than just redescribing these phenomena in dualistic terms, rather than, for example, in the language of symbiosis, the relationship between a feeling of pain and where the pain is located in the body, interconnectedness, inseparability. Instead, he argued that they were different types of things. They were actually different substances, which by that he meant a whole thing that can be characterized by its qualities. We can see an analogy between this idea and the relationship we posit between nouns and adjectives in sentences. The noun is one thing, and the adjectives are the qualities of the noun. But we don't claim that these nouns and adjectives have a different ontological status, different basic things that make up reality. So, for example, today if we described steel in terms of its qualities, its weight and hardness, we wouldn't think that the object steel is different from these or separable from these qualities. Centuries later, Gilbert Ryle, in his book The Mind and the Machine, saw a different way to redescribe mental events and claimed that for any mental event occurring in our mind, it could be translated into our dispositions to do something, a particular action. I don't think this works because it doesn't seem to apply to random images, fantasies. It's unclear what actions are entailed. But one of the main things he wanted to say about mental events that makes them so unique is their certainty, undeniability, indubitability. We can't deny that even if the idea isn't accurate or the belief isn't accurate, we can't deny that we had at one time that idea or that belief. However, when we do describe these mental events as if they were a different type of phenomenon than physical events of which we're not aware, these communications are effective. So that's what I want to talk about today, whether we would lose something important if we substituted a conceptual framework, a language game of brain events for the current language game that we operate on, which entails a difference between mental events and physical events. What might be lost if all our ideas, pains, emotions were described in terms of, for example, neurons? Okay, so although we may be describing our ideas and our pains and our feelings in a way that's neither complete or accurate, it's undeniable that there is a value to describing them as so. For example, if I had a journal in which I recorded my stream of consciousness in a given day and my dreams in a given night, if we journal them, that journal would have specific aims. For example, you might be thinking it might be valuable if you ever wrote a memoir, or it might be valuable in the present day in terms of self-therapy. And even though it's true that for every specific mental occurrence, there is a correlate in terms of a specific brain state. For example, we know that judgments occur in the part of the brain that's known as the frontal lobe. I would argue it wouldn't be a good idea to replace them with a description of the activities of our neurons. This inseparability was documented by John Dewey when he described the nature of habits. Good and bad habits have been established over time and are more difficult to break because of the neurological patterns when repeated often enough. Neurological connections that have been metaphorically solidified may be more difficult to break. And this is important to understand when we look at habits as intentional and subject to adaptation and change. Now, Rorty claims that the mind-body dualism, how we describe things that happen in our mind versus our body, is only used by philosophers in discussing, for example, the mind-body problem, not by scientists or scholars of ethics and religion. I'm not sure what Rorty meant by this, because if, for example, with medicine, if a patient describes his symptoms or her symptoms to a doctor, this description, this subjective description, is essential to a diagnosis. That is, his or her pain descriptions. And a doctor would explain the relationship between the pain and the bodily processes of which the patient may not be aware. But the doctor wouldn't regard them as separable or wouldn't accept this description as having special ontological status, what's real versus unreal, because of its undeniability. Plus, as we know, these descriptions may be inaccurate and imprecise, and the doctor would view these pain descriptions as relevant to the analysis of the person as a whole. Is that pain due to a broken bone, a torn ligament, etc.? Similarly, the mind-body dualistic approach is relevant in psychology, where a patient's description of his irrational beliefs would be essential to an analysis. Is it psychosis? Is it paranoia? Is it addiction? Similarly, in discussions of morality, for example, the previous analogy I made with Dewey's theory of habits, the relevance of habits as adaptations of the mind and the body of a whole person has been recognized as relevant in judgments of responsibility. My example, who would we consider more blameworthy? A teenager beginning a lifetime of drinking problems, starting with his behavior as a teenage binge drinker, or an elderly alcoholic who goes through withdrawal symptoms that are very painful, very awful. Dementia, in the case of an elderly alcoholic, is a deterioration of the brain. And so it is relevant to his or her blameworthiness as an elderly alcoholic. So Rorty argues that these language games, descriptions of our brain states in the language of consciousness, these language games don't mirror reality. The title of the book, Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature. My view, as far as their inseparability, is that if we replaced our current mental descriptions of mental events with descriptions of brain events, it's unclear that we will benefit in terms of the progress of science. I feel is unlikely to provide a framework by which specific brain states, specific thoughts, feelings, images are correlated with specific thoughts, images, or fantasies. So I would add that if one of the human purposes behind recognizing and describing our mental experiences is assigning blame and responsibility, their immateriality seems irrelevant. For example, in ascribing blame and responsibility in terms of a specific intention, the description of a specific intention to harm someone, it's unclear how pinpointing this event as a specific brain state would entail conclusions about blame, especially given the relationship between one's intentions and the innumerable specific ideas and judgments that preceded it. Brain states could be relevant in terms of a dysfunctional brain and existing damage to the frontal lobe, but so are previous intentions and experiences. For example, let's say we're talking about a bully who's acting out of rage after having been bullied a lot over time. Each mental response to each single instance may have been different. And in an account of blame and moral value, as far as these responses, would include his avowal the first time he was bullied, ignore it, it was humiliating, don't draw attention to it, and the 10th time, feelings of rage, a desire to harm a bully. But a description of brain states, neurological activity would be irrelevant. Similarly, Rorty argues that when we describe our mental reactions to others' treatment, we use the term I. And that means there's a unique individual with a unique history, which is recognized by the author as uniquely his or her own, and which is ineliminable. And their ideas are expression of a unique consciousness, a unique form of intentionality. So Rorty also seems to be suggesting, I would argue, that philosophy can play an important role by taking what's known about brain states and evaluating their impact on intentional action, but would not think that they are valuable in the sense of replacing mental descriptions. For example, the pain of withdrawal from alcohol for a person in a late stage of alcoholism has a physiological explanation. Its severity is measurable in the form of delirium tremens. And information about solidifying neural links is relevant to how easy a habit can be broken. And then ideas about the blameworthiness of a particular addict need to be assessed in light of these physiological data and scientific theories which explains the fact. But these facts would suggest a late-stage alcoholic's blameworthiness for succumbing to his addiction must include judgments about how voluntary his or her behavior is. If the pain is too unbearable, there's not a reasonable alternative to continuing to drink. But in assigning blameworthiness, it would be necessary to understand the trajectory of his experiences as well as his brain dysfunctionality. Rorty has an interesting discussion of our conceptual framework for understanding morality and our description of our moral beliefs and moral principles. Some examples would be, for example, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, utilitarianism, which is based on the right action, maximizing the greatest good of the greatest number, rights talk, which talks about a person's entitlement in view of his humanity. But moral principles and beliefs don't just require a list of facts about suffering, happiness, about our capacity for rationality, but it includes beliefs that are central to many of our institutional frameworks. For example, our current understandings of our right to privacy has a history. Our current understandings about HIPAA and a patient's right to the privacy of his medical records, and our current understandings of what we want to be kept confidential in terms of other records, has a history. And the constitutional history includes the amendment which prohibits the quartering of troops in our homes. That zone of non-interference has been extended. This metaphor of a zone of non-interference has been extended to our sexual activities, our private records, etc. So rather than just seeing these mental events, our moral beliefs, as indubitable, they have this certainty and this status because they're ours, ignores the fact that they are part of institutional and social norms. Similarly, he argues that our moral beliefs are grounded in additional beliefs about who we may become. For example, in the United States, we don't have a law requiring Good Samaritan behavior. There is no punishment for most individuals, not doctors or lifeguards, in terms of saving somebody's life. You're not criminally legally responsible. So similarly, our history, which are the type of people we want to become, for example, not Good Samaritans or not ecologically oriented, can be traced to the beliefs that it's been referred to as NIMBY, that activities which may have harmful effects on society should not take place in our backyard. This could have been buttressed by our ideas about the right to privacy. So moral beliefs include views about how we became what we are, and that would include institutions and practices. One of Rorty's particular concerns is with the elimination of suffering and cruelty. So he would ask, with regard to these problems, which institutions have contributed to human cruelty in contemporary times? I would give examples such as the legacy of slavery, the use of torture in places of rendition, the Ku Klux Klan and its replacement, partial replacement by the neo-Nazi movement, and also the brutality in our penal institutions. All these could be argued to be institutional practices that have supported cruelty in our lives. Another thing about the language game of moral beliefs that's interesting is that he argues that it's a form of we consciousness. I'm not quite sure that he would agree that this characterizes monks' ascetic practices or anyone's practices of penance and silence and solitude. These may not be translatable into we consciousness. And although he does argue that the descriptions of our moral intentions have an essentially I form of consciousness, they are our unique moral interpretations, moral beliefs. But their source, he would agree, comes from a we consciousness. Emmanuel Levinas views the face-to-face encounter with another person as the ultimate ethical reality, as the ultimate ethical demand. So although it's undeniable that a certain person has had these intentions, this fact doesn't warrant separating their existence as persons into two types, mind and body, which correspond to two different types of reality. Even though we use the language game, the mind-body, they're inextricably linked. All these considerations about how we do use the framework of redescriptions of phenomena into mental and physical events is based on Cartesian distinctions between conscious and non-conscious phenomena and still play an important role as a language game. But this doesn't entail their separate substances. As far back as the Greeks, Rorty argues, there has been an ocular metaphor, a metaphor about the mind's eye, vision, that has been used to distinguish mental and physical phenomena. The mind's eye and the body's eye. The body's eye includes what we see, smell, and hear, our sense information, and the mind's eye is how we assimilate those particular experiences into general qualities. And reasoning in the day of the Greeks was looked at, the mind as reason, and reasoning itself was looked at as the grasping of particulars. And philosophical contemplation was viewed as universals, and these are the highest and purest things, universals. These metaphors reveal their viewpoint that the universals, true mirrors of reality, and concrete particulars, sense experiences, are not their only relevant to particulars. Now it seems obvious that these are both correlated with brain states, that these events are being experienced by a whole person. But according to Descartes' model, the mind-body dualism that he argues for is centered on the distinction between them as matter versus immaterial, based on the issue of certainty about a thing's nature in the form of clear and distinct perceptions. So this, in turn, I would conclude, set the stage for a replacement of Descartes' rationalism with Locke's empiricism, looking at what the body experiences immediately and directly of the environment as the basis for the certainty in terms of the mind's representation. And in turn, it explains how the institution of academic philosophy changed from one that's based on wisdom, a quest for wisdom, as in the Greeks, versus a quest for certainty. I'll conclude with the following quote from Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, page 61. Science, rather than living, became the philosophy's subject, and epistemology its center.